Hi guys, it's Kelly here and I'm back with another video. Today's video features some new products from Picket Studios, including two of my illustrations. This one is called Winter Blooms, and it's a floral. This one here is Deck the Halls, and then these two are Peaceful Christmas Flowers and Christmas Tags and Ornaments. Those came out with the previous release, but we're going to be using all of them today because they were all designed to work together. So here with the Winter Blooms, this whole video is all about watercolor, and we're going to talk about a lot of different ways you can watercolor. But you can do the frame and the inside piece are separate. So you can stamp them together to fill up like a whole A2 size card. Or you can stamp just one of them, or you can stamp them together and then die cut them out. Whichever way. I tried to make it as versatile as possible so that we could, all get the most bang for our buck, because, that's how I roll. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to stamp this in some gold pigment ink, and that's going to allow us to emboss it. I'm also going to emboss it in gold. Embossing is one of those tricks as a card maker you can use. If you're new to watercoloring, if you need to watercolor something very quickly, if you want to just play and not really have to spend a lot of time concentrating on how it's going to look, embossing is a really great tool to use to be able to just get a good result without a whole lot of thought behind it, is basically what I use it for. So I do prefer stamping my images twice. The Misty comes in handy for that, any stamp positioner that you have. And then I am going to use some gold embossing ink, and I will just put that right over top. Just like I like stamping twice with my pigment inks, I like adding my embossing powder twice, just to make sure I got it everywhere that it needs to be. While I'm doing this, I am heating up my heat gun so that way when I bring it to the paper, it starts melting the embossing powder almost immediately and really minimizes the amount of warping to my paper. If you do get some warping, whether it be from the heat embossing or from the watercoloring that we're going to be doing, you can always run it through like your die cut or embossing machine with just put it inside a like a copy paper sleeve, like that acts as almost like a carrier sheet to just protect it, but then you can run it through and that pressure should help it to lay flat again. So now this one is done. It is all heat set and nice and smooth. For this one, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm only going to do the outside frame, and I'm going to do that in white. So you may be saying to yourself, Kelly, if it's on white paper and you're going to use white embossing powder, why do you need a white ink? Honestly, because once we start adding the color, it's not going to be just white paper anymore. And so you want that white line, nice, bold, contrasting to the background so that your images show up really clearly. And just like before, I'm going to stamp it twice. I'm going to add the powder twice and then go ahead and heat set it. So with watercoloring, obviously I'm coming at this from a card maker's point of view, but some of the same things are still true even if you are a person who likes to sketch your own design and then add watercoloring to it. Obviously, with the embossing, that would be a little bit more challenging, though they do have embossing pens, I suppose you could sketch with and then heat emboss them. But for the most part, if you are more of a traditional watercolorist, you're going to have them sketched or use the stamp as your base. That's what we're doing today. But you're going to be doing more of a no line look. So this one I am going to stamp. I am using Sand Dune from Altenew, and I am stamping this. Oh, I didn't even say I'm working on Canson Monteval watercolor paper. It is a cold press watercolor paper. I just prefer a cold press. A hot press is smoother. It has less texture, but I don't love the way water moves around on it. But anyway, and I buy the 12 by 16 sheets and then I just cut them down as I need to. So, the reason that I am stamping in this ink is, I don't know if you guys know this, but actually recently Picket Fence started carrying these Altenew inks. So that's awesome. I love when stamp companies work together to support each other. This is the round ornament from the Ornaments and Tags set. I will also be stamping this for a no-line look. And then this is you can tell these are just scraps. So I buy the big pieces and then I cut them down. But I don't throw away those pieces of paper that are smaller than an A2 size card, or, you know, I think these end up being 4x6, honestly, when I originally cut them. But I'm all about using my scraps. So here, I'm using a little bit of masking paper. You can also use masking fluid, which just coats your paint. You paint it on like with a paintbrush, or some of them have like a smaller applicator nozzle, so you could use that. But basically it just creates like a gum surface over the top that you can then paint over, and it will keep that portion of it clear. For stamping, I choose to use the Eclipse masking paper, and then the circle, you know, is a pretty easy one to trim out. Don't get rid of if you're making a lung, don't get rid of the outside piece, because we're going to use that too. So basically here, I'm just stamping my 3 ornaments. And then this one, I'm going to do an ornament, but I'm going to do a pattern on it. So that peaceful Christmas flowers, which are poinsettias, I am going to stamp that onto my ornament as if that is the decoration on my ornament. And in order to do that, I'm going to need this little outside piece that we trimmed off. I will add some more, low-tack tape, pixie tape. I will add some of that around the edges just to make sure I don't get any stamping where I don't want it. But for the most part, like, you just need that little circular piece. It doesn't matter how big it is, as long as it covers, or, you know, covers the outside of the circle. And then I'm going to ink this up again, still using that Sandy Dune ink. And then we will be ready to get into the watercoloring. So for my cards, I'm using the Caron Brush Pro watercolor markers. I'm also going to be using a number 4 round brush and a number 2 round brush. So first things first, let's talk about adding our pigment first. So whether you're using traditional watercolors, or in my case, pens, colored pencils, whatever it is that you're using that it would be a watercolor tool, you have the choice between adding them first or putting down water and then adding them second. So I'm going to show you how they both work. So the one on the left, I chose to put my pigment down first, and that's, I think, the lipstick red is the one that I ended up going with. For this one over here, I'm going to fill it in completely with clean water all the way up to the edge of my stamping. And then I will take my marker in and go around. You want to add it where you want the pigment to be the darkest. So for me, I'm just going to go around the edge so that the center is nice and light. And you'll see that as you're adding the pigment, it just is blooming out into that water. And this is one of the ways that's the easiest way to let the watercolor do the work. So if you put down clean water and you add pigment to it, then it will just, you know, spread and kind of do its own thing. Oftentimes, if you just leave it alone, it will come out super pretty. Here, I started losing some little, some brush hairs out of my brush. Not really sure. Maybe I just haven't used this one in a while. But anyway, so if you just let it bloom out on its own, it will typically end up very pretty. Sometimes I can't leave well enough alone, like you guys just saw me do there, and I kind of move it around myself. I would highly recommend trying your best to leave it alone so that it can do its own thing. If you want to move the pigment around while it's still wet, you can, pick it up and tilt it. Some people paint on a tilted board to start with, so that way they already have it flowing in the direction that they want it to go. For this one, I'm going to put down clean water all over inside the center, but I'm not going to touch the pigment until I have all of the water where I want it to be, because wherever it's wet is where the pigment is going to flow. And so I want to make sure that the whole ornament is completely wet and you don't want it bubbled up, but it should have a sheen on it. It should be enough for it to start spreading. And then if you don't want to take your marker directly into the water, you can create yourself like a little palette. That's what I'm doing on my glass mat over here. And then you can pick that up with your paintbrush and just drop it in wherever you would like to add pigment and let the water just kind of carry it away on its own. So these are kind of like the what do they call it? Wet on dry, wet on wet. Like you have the option to put the pigment down on a dry piece, or you have the option to put the pigment down on a wet piece. So we're doing kind of like a little bit of both. It just looks different because we're using the markers. I do really like these particular markers. They come in lots of bright colors, which is totally up my alley. But if you're not a person who likes bright colors, they do have like skin tones and things like that. Or just use whatever if you already have one that you really like, use that one. If you have zigs, they behave pretty much the same way. So I know those were really popular. I own them as well. So now here, this is like the no time at all, no thought process, no, like totally beginner level, can't go wrong kind of technique. That's what this one is. So I'm using a 1-inch wide brush to just completely saturate my paper. Again, it's not super bubbled up, but everything is wet and does have a sheen on it. You could achieve the same result with spraying it with just a mister. You'll see here in a little bit that I do that just to maintain the moisture, to make sure the pigment's moving. And then from here, I'm just going to start dropping in the pigment. Now, if you know the color wheel, you know that green and red are complementary colors. And so while I do have red flowers, I also have greenery going on. So if you mix them, they can make a little bit of brown, but I will show you how I fix that. So basically, I'm just going to go in with a couple of reds, kind of dot them in, let them bloom out. What I'm doing with the paintbrush in my left hand is basically I'm just holding it down to make sure that the color doesn't just run out to the edges. This would not be a problem if I taped my watercolor paper to a board like you see most artists do. I just am too cheap to... I'm too cheap to waste the paper that it would take for me to tape it down. So I don't. Here, things are obviously sped up. I just wanted you to be able to see kind of the whole process. So I'm adding in some golden yellows, some of those darker greens, and then I'll also add in a little bit of a brighter green. In addition to adding them directly to the paper, there's that little mister I was talking about before to make sure everything, stays wet enough for the pigment to flow. And I am letting it kind of bleed out into that middle area in between. But after a while, like you start kind of getting in there and messing in there. And here what I'm doing is I like spatters. Not everybody does. But that is what I am doing here. I'm just going to pick up some color and then kind of spatter it all over. But it does start to get a little bit muddy because I keep adding things. Like I told you before, watercolor is typically prettier if you just leave it alone. But because I can't, here, if things get a little muddy and you don't like the way they're looking, either go in with a dry paper towel, or in my case, this is a slightly damp microfiber cloth. And I'm just going to pick up the stuff that I don't like. If I need to really remove the color, I can go back in with clean water, apply it, let it sit in those sections to really kind of lift the color, and then go back and blot it again. I didn't think that that was necessary. So once I blotted it the first time, now I can go back in specifically with the colors that I think will look nice in that area, or in some cases where they make sense in that area, like the leaves being green. Watercolor is really, really forgiving. So if you think that you've made a mistake and you've ruined it and whatever, like truly just add some clean water, hit it with a clean paper towel or a clean cloth, and just blot up as much as you can. You can always let it dry, and then start over. Will there be some staining? Possibly, but that doesn't mean that it's ruined forever. Like you didn't waste your paper, waste your embossing powder, or what have you. So I'm just going to keep kind of spreading this color out until I'm happy with the way that it looks, and then I'm going to set it aside to dry. For this next one, this is the one that we were working on before. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put the color down, but see how I did the middle one first? That's because you don't want to work next to two areas that are wet in watercolor. And the one that we just did before, everything was wet because we didn't care where the colors went, right? We were just going to let them do their own thing. Here, where we want a little bit more control, we can still, use quite a bit of water and get the pigment that we want contained inside the ornament. But in order to do that, in order not to have our yellow bleed into our red or our red bleed into our green, you do need to make sure that any place that you've already put pigment is completely dry. And then I'm just going to do the same thing here that, we've been doing. I add the clean water into the center. Once I have enough water, then I will take it out to the edges to touch the pigment and let it start, doing its watercolory magic to start, bleeding that color into the center. If, just like we talked about before, if you need to add more pigment, you can either take your marker directly in and add the pigment directly to the ornament, or you can create that palette on a non-porous surface and, pick that up with your paintbrush and drop it in. There's none of this. There isn't a right or a wrong way to do it. It's just the way that you prefer to do it and get the results that you want. Something I will just mention is if you are trying to use the marker to add the pigment, then you do need to do it while it is still wet. If you take the marker to dry paper, it is not going to blend out. It's going to stay exactly where you put it until you add more moisture. So if it's already starting to dry, either re-wet it or wait for it to completely dry and then do an additional layer. So that's this one. And again, just adding it until I'm happy with the amount of darkness, and then we'll move on to the next one. This one this is the frame that we're actually gonna, paint. So let's say that first one is not necessarily for you. You're like, that first one is maybe a little too messy for me. I want a good result where I don't have to do a lot of thinking, but it doesn't look quite as messy. It looks a little bit more painterly. So that's what we're going to do with this one. Basically, we're going to go in and we're going to wet the areas that we want to add pigment. And I kind of split the card in half. Like I did the right-hand side and a little bit of the bottom, and then the left-hand side and a little bit of the top. But any areas that I was going to add the red marker to, I went in and I added clean water. And then I can go in with the marker, as you see me doing here, and start dropping that pigment in to those flowers, to those little amaryllis and to the berries. And it's still going to let the water do the work. It's still going to, kind of bloom out and look very painterly, but it's much more controlled because we have that embossing. We don't have to worry about working next to two areas that are, right next to each other. It doesn't matter because that moisture stays contained within the embossing lines. So this works really nicely to get a good result, but also be something that you can just have fun with, that isn't going to be overly fussy or stressful, that you can just kind of drop those colors in, where you need them to go, and then move on to the next thing. So again, this is obviously sped up. And I'll be honest with you, normally I try to show the whole process, like from beginning of like plain paper all the way through the building out of the cards. But because there's just so much watercolor in this one that I didn't even get the opportunity to show you how I built the cards. I'm just going to have to tell you, and you're going to have to take my word for it, I guess. So anyway, these other little flowers, the reason that I chose to do the hellebores in the frame is because do you remember last year when we came out with Sweet Holiday, which was one of the first sets that I ever did for Picket Fence? That cupcake has a seasonal, like very much holiday with the candy cane and, all of that. But then it also has this extra cupcake that just has the florals that you can use for any time. That cupcake will fit in the opening of this frame. So you can put them together, where you take out that middle piece and you just have the frame. You can then put the cupcake in the center of this and they will go together because they have those same kind of flowers. Same thing with the ornament that will fit inside this frame, the circle ornament or the present from the ornaments and tags. Like those things will fit in here. In addition to that, the Deck the Halls, which is the sentiment set that we'll be using today for almost all the sentiments. But if it didn't come from the Deck the Halls set, it definitely came from one of the other ones that has the images. That is sized to not only fit into this, opening of the frame, and I mean, wherever else. I think they're really good size sentiments, but, I made it. So I guess that makes sense. But they're also sized so that they fit onto your ornament or your present. Now, that isn't true for every single sentiment, but it is true for the majority. So like the Joy to the World fits on the present box. So if you wanted to do presents and have, a couple of different color presents, and then you had one where you did the, the sentiment on it, that would work really well. Same thing with the ornament, the Noel, which is, I am going to use that one on the ornament, fits perfectly in there. So here I'm just showing you the difference between the two. The whole idea is the same, watered down and then pigment added with the markers, but one is much more controlled than the other. So consequently, two very different results. This one is the, okay, I have to stop and think about it kind of watercolor, because it is the no line. So here, what you see me doing is I am using a number 2 round brush. I am picking up some clean water after I have put down my marker onto my paper. And then what I'm doing is I am blotting the base of the bristles onto my microfiber cloth, because you still want there to be moisture in the tip of the paintbrush. But if you don't blot the base, sometimes you can get that tricky large bead of water that comes out of nowhere. It's kind of like when you're painting, like if you paint your nails, that like you think you have the perfect amount on there, and then all of a sudden there just is like a huge blob of nail polish, and it's because it came from up top and rolled its way down. So that is why we kind of blot the base. This gives us a ton more control. So typically the more water you use, the less control you have. The less water you use, the more control you have. So for something like this, where I am not trying to paint really loosely, I'm trying to, kind of stick to the image as it's designed to be. I definitely use a lot less water. So I just put my pigment down straight from my marker where I want it to be the darkest. And then I add my clean water after I have blotted the base of the bristles from the part where I want it to be the lightest. So the edge of the petal, and then bring that down to the bottom of the petal where they're gathered and they'll be the darkest. Here we're speeding up again. So I wanted to add a little bit of shading. So I actually picked up the ochre, and it ended up being substantially more green than I intended. So I'm going to give that a little bit of time, and I'm going to come back with the praline, which is a little bit more of a golden brown. And I did like that better. But that's why it's kind of important to play around with your colors beforehand, so you know how they look once they water out, because they don't necessarily always look exactly the same. So we're just going to go through, add, the little more colors. Again, you could do whatever you would like for the hollow boards. I chose to do them yellow just to have another color that, was in there and making the bouquet a little bit more interesting. But you could do them, you know, white. That would be great. Here's where we're bringing in the, no, I think I stuck it out one more. Sorry for the focus, by the way. You'll see here in a second. Like, cause I keep having to put my hand up for some reason. The autofocus is not doing me any favors. So I ended up having to stop it and start again. But you didn't miss any of the painting. There's just like a little segue. That's all. So I did end up going in and adding, you know, that little bit of praline just so that they would be a little bit more brown. And then also for the, like the stamen, I ended up using that color as well. So these are, I did another frame like this, but I did not film it, because like I said, I already had so much in here. But I like I like this style of watercolor. I think that it is super pretty. It's really tight. You get the nice, you know, watercolor design. But it does take the longest amount of time. So at least for me, and I know that's probably not the case for everybody, but for me, it takes the longest amount of time. And so I don't typically always do it. I'm much more likely to use some of the other techniques that we've already covered, just because this one really does make me kind of slow down and think about all of the different ways, you know, and then you got to wait so that you're not working next to two areas that are wet. Though with this, I will say with this, like they do dry pretty quickly because we're using a very minimal amount of water to get the pigment to move. This green is the grass green, and I did feel like, maybe it was a little bit too bright. I did another video on my channel a little while, like quite some time ago, that talked about how we can mix the colors with their complementary colors to kind of like bring them down a notch, you know, to desaturate them. But I decided that I was just going to go ahead and let it be bright, even though it was maybe a little bit brighter than I would have normally chose. I liked the fact that there was contrast between that and the darker green, like the more, it is on the more blue side, but it's not a teal. Like when I say blue green, it's not a teal. But anywho, so I used that darker green for the pines. And that one is really just kind of following along with the, like the pine needles. I didn't worry about having it be exact. So like, I'm sure if you looked at the image, you know, you might see some of that ink kind of peeking through, but it wasn't enough that it bothered me. You could definitely, you know, take your time and go over every single pine needle that I drew in there. But I think that, you know, giving the suggestion of where it's supposed to go is good enough, at least for me. And for that, I used very minimal water just so that I would have the detail of the pine needles. I also mixed the two together and then kind of went back in and put in the stem and stuff for the other leaves to help them stand out a little bit. This is the ornament, and I did it the same way, so I didn't include the whole process, but I did want to show you just at the beginning what I did. I did the same exact thing that we just did. I just did it with the poinsettias on the ornament. The only other thing that was slightly different here is I did pull out a little bit of a cool gray to add some shading around the edges to help the ornament look a little bit more rounded. But other than that, I did the same thing. I put down the pigment where I wanted it to be the darkest, came in with some clean water, added that to the edge of the petal, and then brought the clean water to the pigment and let it kind of bloom out. If I needed to go back in and added any more pigment, I either picked it up off the palette from the glass mat, or if it was a large enough space, I went in directly with the marker. So this one's exactly the same. I just wanted you to know which one I chose to use with it, because we are almost to the end of this video. So once I built the cards out, which I did, you know, some of them are flat, some of them are popped up. These are just the final pieces, the watercolor pieces after they're dry, before I put the cards all together. Just a little recap of what we're working with here. I was really happy with the way that all of them came out. This is the dies. So there is, for the winter blooms, there's an outside die for the frame, and then there's an inside die for the like smaller floral cluster. So you can see both of those here. And then the circle, I think it would be really fun to just do some general circles with these. So I have to kind of play around with that a little bit. But this is just adding some gemstones to the, I added them to all of the cards, honestly. I think except for the one with the 3 hanging ornaments. And then this is, I think it's called North Pole, I think is the mix, the rhinestone mix. And it's got some neutral like whites and like pale yellows, to like a bright red and like a garnet, and then a lighter green. So really just great for all the Christmas cards. So I use this on all of the cards. So here's this one that we did the no line look with. And then the this one is the one we did the no line look with, but I actually cut it in half. So that's the center one cut in half, and then I glued it to opposite sides. This one here is the one that was a little bit messier. I cut out that middle piece and then put in a gold hexagon. My 2 ornament ones, one of them I did use the stamp that was included for the string, and the other one I just cut gold paper. So that's all of them. I hope this inspires you to kind of get out your watercolor and give it a go, no matter what your style is. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I always appreciate your time, and I will catch you on the next video. Bye.